Hello, I'm Ryan Cook, and this is Civic Tech Chat, a show that looks at the way technology, politics, and policy impacts the world around us, the tools we use, the way services are delivered, and how we talk about and set policy all shape our society. We'll gather around and have a chat about these things together and more. Before we get started, I do want to let you all know that we've started a Discord for the podcast. There will be a link with an invite down in the episode description. Do feel free to go check that out. It's a small community right now, but hoping to grow it. It's a great way to reach out to me and let me know things that you might want us to cover, or to just hang out and talk about civic tech. Anyway, let's go ahead and start the show. Aiden, thank you so much for joining us here on Civic Tech Chat. Could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I am a freelance technologist. Been starting doing that this year, working with nonprofit and government customers. So past 7 years before that, working as a federal employee at a couple digital service teams. So first 18F, and then a small team in the Census Bureau called XD, and then back to TTS, which is also in the General Services Administration. So that's been like my tech life for the past while. And outside of that, I teach people to code, and also I'm a modern dancer.
I was going to go to the next question, but with the end there, I kind of have to ask, what do you mean by modern dancer?
Yeah, so I have been dancing longer than I've been doing tech work, and went to college for both and pursued both in parallel since, and been able to, keep it going as like a thing I do outside of my day jobs, and work with a few dance companies and perform pretty regularly. And it's a nice balance to like kind of have the very cognitive work and then the, very physical work to balance it out.
Oh, that is very cool. I think it's a good thing to be able to have those kind of things to balance out like that.
Totally.
And Aiden, what would you say is your personal why? That thing that drives you to get out of bed each morning and do all those things?
Yeah, I mean, I have those, kind of three areas that I do professionally. So, I think we're just going to be mostly talking about the tech one today. So within that, I really enjoy like making things work better. That comes up as like tools and process and automation and documentation, things that end up being pain points for people, finding ways to like kind of reduce that friction and all that. So the civic tech interest broadly came from backgrounds and interests in engineering and teaching, and then also open source and like transparency more broadly. So that brought me from the tech companies into civic tech back in like 2014. And the work in government has been a thing that I've liked way more than I thought I would. Starting out, kind of no one's there to just like get rich or that kind of thing. Like people are there because they want to be, and there's just so much room for improvement. So any sort of impact you can make, either making the other staff's lives better or the end users' lives better, is a huge win.
Are there any pieces of media, whether we're talking a podcast, a book, video, or some other such thing, that you would recommend to the folks out there listening?
Yeah, so I am a huge podcast addict. I have a whole spreadsheet of recommendations that I send to people. So if you're interested, reach out. One episode I really like that kind of touches on or is adjacent to like civic tech is an episode of 99% Invisible, which is a show about kind of design and architecture. And they do a show on curb cuts. And so for those who aren't familiar, those are like the ramps that go like onto sidewalks from streets. Those were not always around. That was like a past 50 years kind of thing. And that came about because of like advocacy of wheelchair users, but ended up being really beneficial for people with strollers and grocery carts and bikes, and had all these like positive spillover effects. the development of those like led to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then the concept of universal design, which is like designing for the greatest number of people possible. And if you make things accessible, then it ends up being better for kind of every category of users. So I really love that physical analogy to it's very applicable to like digital products as well.
As we hop to our kind of main topic area, let's start off by defining a term we're probably going to use a fair number of times, or at least I have it written in this question sheet a bunch of times, which is the term Devsecops. When you're using that phrase, what are you describing?
Yeah, so it's really common in probably the enterprise IT world, certainly in the government tech world. Not something I came up with, but a lot of my work kind of falls in there. So it's a compound word of development, security, and operations. This was sort of the successor to the term DevOps, which was focusing on bringing those two practices and types of teams together, because historically, like, they'd operate sort of in isolation, and the development team would throw their software over the wall to operations folks and never kind of see it once it hits production. And so that compound word is literally like overlapping those two concepts and teams and kind of making it more of a blended thing. DevSecOps just sticks security in there, and very intentionally in the middle, I think. So this is, ensuring that security tooling and processes and security expertise are all part of like building and operating software. And, practically this can mean things like automating dependency upgrades, or doing some sort of intrusion detection, or other things like security focused code reviews, right? The more human part. So, anything that kind of glues those people with those different sets of experience together, and tries to break down like the silos.
Folks looking at the title of this episode also probably noticed the mention of the phrase human-centered. Often we discuss that when we're talking about things like inclusion of UX research techniques and processes for software to help ensure the stuff getting built is actually useful to the human beings that ultimately want to use the thing. How does that fit in with this DevSecOps space?
Yeah, so focusing on the end user, which is often the public for government services, that focus is great, and I very much applaud that. Where I see a big gap is when you're talking about internal systems and internal policies and this kind of thing. It often does not get the same kind of care and attention that the external stuff does, and the external stuff doesn't even necessarily get as much attention as it should get. So, there's questions that you can ask to, kind of start thinking this way, which is like, what's frustrating for the staff, or, whoever your support or your teammates, right? Whoever you're thinking about. And then, there's also things like what keeps them up at night, right? So you can have like security experts come in and do, penetration tests and things like that. But your team is also probably have like a decent sense of like where gaps are. And so you can ask them. So, with these kinds of questions, and then, so subsequent planning and fixing of them, like, you can address those frictions and fears, and through that improve productivity and morale and retention. So it's all actually has like positive effects beyond just like addressing the issue. So listening to internal staff and making the right thing the easy thing, I'm sure that's going to come up again today, but all these things can be applied to kind of the external facing processes, right? Your forms that you present to users, or processes you make them go through to get benefits, or what have you. Then it can also apply to your technical systems and platforms and things that you offer internally, but it can also apply to stuff like HR or training or anything else. So it's just that mindset of like, what does this person want to do? What's preventing them from doing it?
Okay, I think what I'm hearing from you there is effectively that, like, UX techniques, like research techniques, don't just have to apply to things you're building, right? Like, I think early in your answer you mentioned the idea of like, well, policy sometimes can like get in the way of folks. And so it's kind of, I guess what you would suggest is when you're coming up with, say, an organizational policy, the first step might be to start by asking those questions, like conducting those interviews with folks it would affect. Am I kind of hearing that correctly?
Absolutely. And just teaching, treating your staff within your organization or whoever your thing affects, like treating those people as users, like with respect and understanding like what they're trying to get out of it or what they would want changed and that kind of thing, and trying to address their needs.
In a talk, you go into some detail about ways you can utilize processes and tools to run projects. I gather a fair bit of it seems to fall along the theme of really trying to like keep things somewhat simple. Is that a principle folks should be actively trying to follow as they go to manage these projects?
Yeah, there's a quote by the mathematician Blaise Pascal that's, I made this longer than usual because I have not had time to make it shorter. So I think it's awesome, like attributed to Mark Twain and that kind of thing, but it's actually Pascal. It's not an easy thing to do, right? Like simplification is not, usually the first way that something happens, right? You have to refine and refine in order to get there. Technology choices, architectures of systems, policies, and that kind of thing. Like any simplification you can find can save you pain later because it reduces the number of moving parts and, or the clarity of what you're trying to express if it's a policy, that kind of thing. And that's important because like in technological systems, for example, complexity leads to bugs, leads to, edge cases that you didn't think of. And those can sometimes be security vulnerabilities or other problems. And so, the more that you can remove moving parts is a good idea. It's easier said than done, of course. So a way that I suggest thinking about it, and this also, sort of parallels with like what do you build versus what do you buy. So it's kind of the same thinking, which is like what's your differentiator? What's your like thing that you're trying to do that's unique here, as opposed to what's a commoditized need, right? What are problems that other organizations have had and solved, and like can you just use whatever they're using, which will often be software as a service or whatever, right? So differentiating between those two can go a long way to cutting out complexity and sort of offloading it to someone else.
You've also talked about how humans are inherently bad at making estimates, which leads you to advocate for estimates that are less granular, which might be somewhat counterintuitive for some folks as they like come across that. I think the guideline you mention is to say it's either days, weeks, or months, but without numbers for prepending any of those things. Can you talk a bit about the advantages of going that way?
Yeah, I once went to a budgeting meeting and I brought a jar of jelly beans and I had people guess, like budgeting, people that like do budgeting professionally for information technology. I had them try and guess how many jelly beans were in this jar, and the answers were all over the place. And I said to them is like, you can see everything that's here, right? This jar's in front of you, nothing's changing, there's no surprises. And still we were like way off in terms of how many are there. Like this is the same thing for software projects, but for some reason we think that no, this time if we like really, really concentrate, we're going to figure it out. And the truth is, there's a concept from, I believe, Pragmatic Programmer of sort of outdriving your headlights. So, you're trying to like guess at things that are out of your line of sight. And it's just not possible. So, whether it's guessing in points in terms of like estimating tasks and that kind of thing, like people argue about what the points mean. If you are in teams that do exact estimates, like, this number of days or this number of months, like this particular day will be done, those are going to be wrong and that leads to tension. So days, weeks, or months, no numbers, strikes a balance of being specific enough to give a rough order of magnitude, and everyone kind of knows what you're talking about, but then also is vague enough to give a reasonable amount of wiggle room as things come up. So sometimes there's hard deadlines and there's nothing you can do, and then in that case it's a matter of being ruthless about the priorities and determining what constitutes your minimum viable product, and then what are nice to haves.
Yeah, in some environments where this might apply, including government projects, there can kind of be a tension around this where it's like, oh, we want to be agile and adapt and learn to things. Basically, I think the headlights analogy maybe fits here. It's like, adjust the things that you can see. But then also, as we were talking about estimates, they also want these like long-term projections, those more exact estimates that I think you're pointing to as being usually folly to try to do. How should someone go about trying to balance these kind of competing concerns when you're working with a partner?
I think it's important to keep empathy, to remain empathetic, right? If there's a reason that your boss is asking for a long-term estimate, like, or, if they are asking for that, like, there's probably a reason. So what is that reason? Like, can you investigate that and actually figure out why? So as an example, like this came up in that budgeting team that funds IT projects, and they were asking for projects to estimate multiple years out. Well, they weren't just doing that because it turns out that the Office of Management Budget wanted financial projections 5 years out for the overall fund, and so to get projections for the overall fund, they have to give projections for all the things that they're funding. So it is entirely like reasonable that they are requiring that of projects because of things being imposed on them. But you then, once you sort of understand root causes, you can then find other ways to address, right? Is there a way to like meet that need and yet like structure things in a way that, leads to good results? So for example, instead of, everyone guessing what their project costs are going to be 5 years out, could we flip it on its head and say, hey, we're going to give this project $1 million for 3 years and like do whatever you can for $1 million, right? This is like the agile principle of like, fixed costs, flexible scope, or fixed resources, flexible scope, that kind of thing. So, if you get 2 major features done this year versus 3 major features done, like, that just depends on things that come up that you couldn't have anticipated. And yeah, those long-term, medium-term goals you agree on, like those can be fixed, and you could even like fix the costs, like as I just described. But the day-to-day and week-to-week can kind of be up to the team to prioritize.
It sounds a bit by flipping that you're kind of, instead of asking like how much time and energy will it take to do X, it's more like, well, how much time and energy are you willing to invest in X to see like where things end up? Is that I guess that's right. Effectively the angle?
Yeah, because you don't know how long it's going to take to build X given feature. So we can say, all right, we want 5 people working on this for a year, and here are our goals. Let's see how far they get.
In a talk focused on this same topic, you make reference to a piece written by Pete Hodgkin. I probably mispronounced that, and apologies to Pete, but it's called Hello Production, which advocates for trying to deploy something useless as early as you possibly can. Why is that a good thing to advocate for?
Yeah, I like this article a lot. A big driver for this approach is to avoid surprises. And that applies to both the team, like trying to deliver whatever system, or again, that's going to apply to policy and that kind of thing. Both, sort of internally on the team working on it, but then also the people that it affects on the other side. So developing, system or policy or whatever in isolation avoids interacting with all those people that might crop up along the way. So for a technical system, this might be the security team. This might be enterprise architecture people. This might be lawyers. This might be the end users, et cetera. The sooner that you get something out of production, the sooner you can like force those problems out of the woodwork that might appear later, and reveals those blockers early. That's great because you can now have like start to address them sooner and do that in parallel with the iterations of development, and hopefully like strike balance and kind of negotiate like an understanding with the stakeholders of like, okay, what are the things that they want to know about? Well, they want to know if there's a change to the encryption that you're using, or they want to know if there's a change to the types of personally identifiable information that comes up or whatever. But you can know that by going through the process. And once you have that agreement, that allows you to like sort of get in a cadence of delivering more quickly, as opposed to like a big bang release, which is, we've worked on this for months or years, and now we're trying to finally ship to production, and all this stuff, that we didn't know about happens at the end. It gets that out of the way sooner.
It sounds a bit like going through this process early is, in a way, almost kind of a UX research step in and of itself, right? When you try to deploy something, you mentioned stakeholders, right? In a way, you're kind of figuring out who they even are by who ends up being concerned and wanting to show up to meetings when there's questions about how to deploy different things. It sounds like that's probably pretty crucial to figuring out how ultimately your system should be set up at the end.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, if you can just deploy a landing page, that's kind of the system equivalent maybe of like a UX researcher doing like a wireframe diagram or a paper prototype, right? It's like the simplest thing that someone can use that like demonstrates the thing. This is the equivalent for a sort of functional system of like, can we get, like if we're building a web app, like can we get it up at a URL? Like what does that take? Right? It's the it's the through line. It's also been referred to as like a walking skeleton. Like what's like the simplest thing that demonstrates like we've developed some code, even if it is just a landing page, and like deployed it, and that thing is operational and has security things in place and whatever.
Oh, I like your mention of it being like a wireframe, like that comparison or analogy, because I think that's something that a lot of partners can kind of like grok and get their heads around. Like it's something you can usually see, but saying it's like that, but for these systems, maybe that's like an effective way to describe it to folks that are like less familiar, say, with the deployment process.
Yeah, I had not really put that together before this conversation, but yeah, I hope so.
Folks listening might be aware it can be rather difficult to try to prioritize work in the Devsecops space, especially if you have to weigh it against other concerns. Whether you're talking about energy being put into like different features and things, or like basically different competing things that are going on a project. What approaches have you found effective in tackling that kind of problem?
For this, my mother would say, like, take my advice, I'm not using it. So it's something I want to get better at. But an approach that I've used and I've seen others use that seems to be really effective is kind of playing amateur psychologist and figuring out what all those stakeholders' motivations are. Because then you can speak to those motivations or, use that to influence your decision making and avoid surprises, and also get people on your side. So that might happen through finding what their hopes are, what their frustrations are, what their fears are, right? And this could be bosses, CIOs, like legislative people, whoever might like impact the direction of the project. So if you can address those things, right, then you're probably not going to have an issue getting prioritized because they want you to succeed, and this is good for them too. So, earlier I mentioned like asking team members about things that annoy them or keep them up at night. The way I did this with a couple clients is this exercise where we list out their hopes and frustration and fears, and I'd sort of get that through like doing one-on-one interviews, but you could do it in a group as well. So we sort of get those all up and combine them and that kind of thing, and then map them to underlying problems. So, okay, the thing that keeps me up at night is what if our site goes down and there's no one to no one knows about it or something. Well, all right, the underlying problem is that we don't have proper monitoring in place, so we don't have a good fallback for system downtime and that kind of thing. All right, then we can come up with solutions, and that in a way is easier once you identify the underlying problem. So with those, the team can prioritize and come up with like, okay, what are the actual problems we want to solve, not just prioritizing the solutions. And if everyone agrees on that, then you have your list, and that you prioritize the things at the top, and you might need to choose whether fixing this potential security risk is more important than a feature. But that's how priorities work. You have to deprioritize some things in order to prioritize others. And that's just something you have to accept.
And having those priority conversations, I imagine, can come into scenarios where there's a lot of noise around it. Sometimes there are the even potential like stakeholders that are prescriptive in their nature. I think of what that phrase is like authority to operate kinds of requirements, or processes and things that are can be a bit difficult to maneuver around. But we've also in this conversation talked about this wish to try to remain human centered, and like how we go about designing these systems, implementing policy. How can a team either kind of keep focus or return focus in these conversations to that like centering principle of trying to be human centered and also like maintaining things with these stakeholders?
Yeah, so there's a few ways to answer that, I think. One is to remember that the people involved in maybe Byzantine processes, they're people too. And maybe they're running it that way because they feel pressure to do so. And so it kind of goes both ways. So that goes back to what I was talking about of like, what are people's hopes and frustrations and fears and pressures? Like, why are things the way they are? In order to address them, I'm going to go back to like user research and usability tests. I was on teams where even as an engineer, I was like kind of brought in and assisting like running these with UX professionals, and you just learn so much watching people like try and struggle with the thing you built or the thing you're planning to build, that kind of thing. Those practices are thankfully becoming a lot more common in government, and I'm sure beyond government with external facing offerings, so sort of public facing products. But the same can be applied to internal systems and policies and processes. This can be either like user research, which is often like done kind of beforehand, the usability testing, which is as you're building the thing, and retrospectives, I think, are really helpful even just within the team to kind of get people to air their pains and frustrations and that kind of thing, and kind of help everyone work better together, because you're not going to get anything done if people are fighting. So all those things can help you reflect on like what your medium and long-term goals should be. Like, what are the user stories we're trying to address, right? What are like the top line like problems, and everything else like folds in under those. And then looking at, okay, our tasks that we see on our project board or whatever, like, are those actually moving us towards those goals? If not, maybe we shouldn't do them. So last thing I'll say about it is, in terms of treating everyone as a human, like hammering on people to like, this has to be like directly related to this user, otherwise like it's a complete waste of time. That's not a good way to approach things either. So there's actually a balance, and I think it's healthy to give staff like time to work on things they want to work on, just something they're excited about, even if it doesn't like meet the threshold of like, is this moving us closer to our like handful of top line goals? So this can be hackathons or 20% time, bug smash days, like however you want to do it, giving them time to learn something new, experiment, fix an annoyance, that kind of thing. It can be a nice just relief.
That last bit you mentioned there, I think something I'm hearing there is effectively like you can kind of almost go too far on the spectrum to a point where like you're too rigorous in the other direction, which sounds like maybe it creates some of the same sorts of stresses that the other end of the spectrum might have created through that rigor. Is that so?
I think that's right. It's important to remember that like people are only going to do their best work if they're happy, and a way that like a lot of people are going to kind of let off steam, or maybe get to work with someone they don't normally get to work with, or scratch an itch, like that kind of thing, is to like give them a little bit of room to explore, or to have some self-determination. So that's another way of thinking about it, is okay, instead of like the stakeholders are dictating everything to us and we just have to do the things that have been prioritized, I actually get some agency and I get to pick something I want to work on. And that could just go a long way to to building up people's, kind of trust in each other and like excitement about what they're doing and that kind of thing.
In some of your work, you talk about this idea of trying to create a golden path that is kind of preferred for folks to use, but not something that's maybe explicitly required. You describe an idea that probably seems familiar to folks who enjoyed their game theory classes. I know when I was reading this part of your work, I was having flashbacks to grad school about like the little charts and trying to figure out best perceived payout. But ultimately, like the idea is you want to make the desired behavior easier and more rewarding than the alternative thing that maybe you don't want them to do as much. What advice would you give folks that are trying to emulate this model that you've described?
Yeah, maybe I need to take a game theory class. I've not done that, but the way I think about it is that people are going to, there's a gravity to whatever someone's trying to get done, and they're going to find whatever they need to do that. You as maybe a person offering a centralized platform, right, is sort of the classic example, like running like the enterprise level tools. You want it to be the thing you're offering, but that's not always going to be the case. People go off and use like shadow IT, right, which means kind of the things that aren't approved and aren't desirable to the people running the centralized things. So if you want to make your product desirable, I'd say that's half the battle, actually. Like just getting people past we said you are supposed to use it, so you have to use it, the end. If you can get past that to, okay, how do we actually make this like easy, if not actually a pleasure to use? Just that mindset goes a huge amount of the way. But, so the remaining bit of actually getting it there is, I think, treating it like a product, and a product that like needs to win customers rather than having a sort of captive audience. So there's a great blog post by Sean Boots called "If You Want Enterprise Services to Be Good, Make Them Optional," and it's a really nice way of thinking about it. Of what would it take to make this something that the target audience would choose over alternatives versus being forced, because forcing someone to use something is a losing battle. So you can look at the alternatives, look what else people are doing, and figure out like, okay, if there are people that are choosing not to use it or being resistant, like why are they choosing to resist it? Can we go beyond just our ability to kind of lay down a rule of this is our enterprise policy and entice them? So like someone might not be using it because they're not aware of it. They might have experience in whatever tool they're using right now, and they would have to do a bunch of learning in order to move over. There could be actual transition costs of okay, we have to migrate all this data, and that's a pain. And they could also have tried what you're using and not liked it, and so can you address those issues? To do all these things, it really, really helps to have your internal systems leverage people with like product and design and content experience, right? Like make the documentation good, make it visually appealing, right? As opposed to kind of the crappy internal software that we've all seen. And yeah, like how can you make it like alleviate their pain points so that like they're on your side, they're excited to use this thing and give feedback and all of that.
I think I'm hearing in your answer there that a lot of the core of like figuring out this golden path idea comes back to like doing that effectively like UX research that we've been talking about kind of throughout here. It kind of applies also just to like even trying to convince folks to use like the preferred set of tooling. Is that so?
Absolutely. I've gotten a ton out of working with UX people, and just the idea that you're trying to get something done. You meaning like your user in this case is trying to get something done. What are their options? Why are they choosing one versus another? What do they wish they were able to do? What is like preventing them from being able to do it? That kind of thing. it's applicable in so many places, and it really is, so much about incentives and resources, and there's equity elements in there as well. Yeah, the principles apply all over the place once you like start to learn about them, and I just love that.
If an organization's kind of found itself maybe a bit into where the shadow IT, like as the phrase you used, is kind of already happening. Folks are already kind of finding ways to do the task that maybe aren't preferred by the organization or that they see as maybe inherently more risky. Are there ways that folks should attempt to kind of try to act to pull that back? Is it basically the same, like you just go back and start doing that research at that time, or are there other things you might suggest folks do if it's like a little further along?
I think understanding what people are using for what, right? So can you sort of bucket the tools that people are using, and like ask yourselves as the, maybe enterprise IT people, like, do we actually care? Like how big of a deal is it that this team is using, project management tool X and this team is using project management tool Y? Do we actually care? Well, okay, maybe that doesn't matter so much, but like we do want to make sure people are using like a safe email system. And so like, let's make sure that everyone's using the right email system. And maybe instead of focusing on the tools, like, okay, why do we want everyone on the same tool? Well, we need to ensure that like data is being like shared and protected safely. Okay, can we kind of teach people just enough about that, and that could be applicable to any of the tools? And would that go like most of the way? Maybe. Can we, if we have a principle of like, we don't put sensitive information in our project management tool, then does it matter what project management tool they're using? Because, if it gets hacked or something, like it's not the end of the world. So there's, I think it's useful for the centralized folks to sort of question like, well, what do we actually care about? And can we prioritize? Because trying to like set up walls around like what people can't do is going to make people upset with you. And so let's prioritize what's going to make the biggest impact in terms of, cost savings or security or that kind of thing. Focus on those, and maybe decide where we're okay with people doing things that are outside of, kind of the centralized offerings, and just make sure that they understand the principles of like, what is it that we're concerned about, and can they incorporate that into their day-to-day.
Aidan, thank you so much for joining us here on Civic Tech Chat. I have no doubt folks are going to find some nuggets of wisdom to take into their day and learn from as they listen.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fun.
You can follow us on Twitter using the handle @CivicTechChat. Visit us on the web at civictech.chat, or subscribe to us for content updates wherever it is you download your podcasts.